Tras la decisión del Congreso de Estados Unidos de no incluir financiación adicional para Ucrania en la ley temporal de financiación para evitar el cierre del gobierno, el presidente Joe Biden dijo que espera plenamente que el presidente de la Cámara de Representantes, Kevin McCarthy, al igual que la mayoría de los republicanos, aprueben nuevos fondos para Kyiv. Sin embargo, no a decir si había recibido garantías específicas sobre el asunto. Vamos a retomar contacto con nuestro compañero José Levi desde Jerusalén, que como siempre nos tiene información sobre este tema. La preocupación en Estados Unidos con este cierre de gobierno, José, y bueno, aunque no todo está status quo previo a este momento preocupante, lo que sí se vio afectado fueron los fondos de Ucrania.
Sí, efectivamente, se había pedido, Alejandra, buenos días, 6.000 millones de dólares para continuar con esa ayuda, que ya son 43.000 millones de dólares solamente en lo que respecta a ayuda militar. Pero ahora vemos que en Ucrania expresan cada vez más alarma, aseguran que si no se reanudara esta ayuda, como decías, Joe Biden confía que sí se reanude, aunque no da garantías, y si no hubiera una reanudación, algo así sería catastrófico para Ucrania en el campo de batalla. Llevaría a que no se pudiera financiar esta guerra, ya que hay que tener en cuenta que tan solo la ayuda económica de Estados Unidos, si uno mira desde el segundo país al 11º país, o sea, los 10 siguientes, cuál es su ayuda económica, todos juntos no llegan a la ayuda que presta Estados Unidos. Entonces, algo así es fundamental. Vimos ayer a Josep Borrell, el responsable de la política exterior europea, que aseguró que hay que continuar con las ayudas, que no pueden depender de los avances que haya un día o una semana determinada en el campo de batalla, que se trata de un problema existencial, dijo, para Europa. Entonces vemos que efectivamente existe ahora cada vez más concienciación de la necesidad de esa ayuda. Esto cuando vemos que en el campo de batalla efectivamente no hay grandes cambios. Vemos que hubo más de 30 drones lanzados por Rusia contra objetivos en el interior de Ucrania. 29 de ellos fueron interceptados, también un misil de crucero Iskander. Y también hay una denuncia ahora rusa de que en la región de Briansk, rusa, cercana a Ucrania, Ucrania habría lanzado bombas de racimo, violando así, dirían en Rusia, un compromiso claro de Ucrania de recibir estas bombas que más de un centenar de países en el mundo prohíbe, pero con la condición de únicamente utilizarlo contra zonas militares. Aseguran ahora en Rusia que también habrían sido utilizadas contra zonas civiles, pero sin causar víctimas. Alejandra.
Me gustaría cambiar ahora un poco el tema, José. ¿Qué se sabe sobre el supuesto testamento de Yevgeny Prigozhin?
Bueno, lo que ahora dicen distintas cuentas de Telegram rusas es que aparentemente habría dejado todo su imperio a su hijo Pavel Prigozhin, de 25 años, muy joven, y también le habría dejado el control del movimiento mercenario Wagner. Entonces, ahora aparentemente Pavel Prigozhin intenta hacerse con las cantidades ingentes de dinero que dejó su padre, también conseguir de vuelta los 800 millones de dólares que aparentemente Rusia debe todavía a este movimiento Wagner. Y uno de los grandes temas ahora que se desconoce cómo se va a solucionar es que aparentemente Pavel Prigozhin querría crear o volver a comandar el grupo mercenario Wagner, como ya lo hizo su padre, pero sin un control directo del Ministerio de Defensa ruso, sino actuar de manera independiente. Veremos cómo se soluciona o no ese problema.
CNN's Nada Bashir is following developments for us. She joins us live from London. Good morning to you, Nada. So what is the significance of Monday's meeting in Kyiv, especially given the uncertainty over ongoing US funding for Ukraine?
Well, you're absolutely right, Rosie. I mean, the timing of this is significant. And on the symbolic front, this meeting of EU foreign ministers within Ukraine is deeply symbolic. This was the first time that the Foreign Affairs Council was opened in Kyiv, in Ukraine. Of course, we heard from the Ukrainian foreign minister yesterday, Dmytro Kuleba. He described this meeting as not necessarily taking place within EU borders at this point right now, but in his words, in future EU borders. So deeply symbolic on that front. And of course, we heard from the European Union Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell. He spoke about this as being an expression of the will and the commitment of EU member states to continue supporting Ukraine, particularly, of course, on the heels of that somewhat controversial decision taken by the US Congress to not include provisions for additional funding for Ukraine in that emergency budget. But of course, we have heard renewed and vocal expressions of support from EU leaders, particularly when it comes to funding. Take a listen to this statement from the German foreign minister speaking yesterday.
With this Foreign Council of EU foreign ministers, we are taking the European Union to where the heart of Europe beats strongest at the moment. Here in Kyiv, here in Ukraine. Ukraine's future lies in the European Union, in our community of freedom, and it will soon stretch from Lisbon to Luhansk, with every village, with every meter that Ukraine liberates, with every meter where it saves its people. It also paves its way into the European Union.
And of course, there were no official conclusions or agreements made at this meeting. This was not technically an official meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council, given that it did take place outside of EU premises. But we have seen some practical movement on discussions around Ukraine's future accession to the European Union, or prospects around Ukraine's future accession. We heard from the Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, saying that there were discussions around this, positive indications. He believes that the EU and Ukraine are on the same page in terms of those negotiations, and is hopeful that those negotiations can begin before the end of this year.
Dominic, as you touched on, Fico pledged to end support for Ukraine. So what could his coalition government mean, if he's able to form it, for Russia's war on Ukraine?
Yeah, well, this is a very complicated situation, because they are essentially ran a campaign which in many ways was sort of taking the pulse on how these issues would play out in a national context. Those particular talking points pertaining to Russia, end of support for Ukraine, are diametrically opposed to the positions of the European Union on these questions. The European Union and NATO, I should add, have been very clear on this. In this particular conflict, there is a clear aggressor. It is Russia, and there is a country that has been illegally occupied, and that is Ukraine. Moving to a negotiating table, even though everybody hopes for peace, is essentially to argue, without Russia having been withdrawn, that somehow both parties have a legitimate claim. This is a very risky proposition. It sets an awful precedent in terms of invasion. But I think the bigger issue, Rosemary, here is that we see a kind of fracture developing amongst European Union member countries on these particular questions. And we know that the Russian propagandist machine has been very adept at exploiting these kinds of polarizing issues.
And Dominic, what do we need to know about Robert Fico and, of course, his relationship with Russia's President Vladimir Putin?
Yes, well, I mean, these are, like, for example, Orban in Hungary, political leaders that have a track record of walking a very fine line between adherence to the European Union, from which the country benefits exponentially financially, while at the same time not so much being in the sphere of influence of Russia, but working along the principles of a kind of sympathy and of sort of nostalgia for that kind of relationship. And in this particular context of conflict, in which neutrality is simply not an option, those particular positions are problematic when it comes to the broader question of EU and NATO and how they want to go about handling this. And we see this particular figure, therefore, as disrupting the focus of the EU and NATO on these particular questions.